So warm welcome to this session entitled The Elephants in the China Shop. Did we get it wrong? How can we fix it? So China has been mentioned already more times today than I can recall. It's obviously on everyone's mind, and it's really China's unprecedented transformation, which was also alluded to earlier today. I mean, lifting literally hundreds of millions of citizens out of poverty. And China is, of course, set to overtake the United States as the largest economy in due course. Also this shift, this economic shift from west to east has come up several times. And really the country is on the cusp of becoming a global tech superpower. And for decades, I think many assumed that sort of Western liberal democracies enjoyed an inherent superiority when it came to innovation or economy or technological prowess, and we are now seeing that that's not the case. So I think many assumptions that were made were frankly simply wrong. And I thought it was really good what the New York Times recently said. They did a nice series on China, which I'm sure many of you had seen. But it said China didn't like the West's playbook, so it wrote its own, which I thought was very well put. And I think it wasn't really anticipated by many policy planners or people that are responsible for anticipating these kinds of developments. So China's rise really has, I would say, implications that go far beyond economy. And I'm sure that some of this will come up here. But it has really also led to many to call for a rethink of how the West approaches China, and particularly the assumptions that many had made about China in the last decades. I just alluded to it. So, but of course, one of the key purposes of strategic foresight is precisely to help us challenge and to help us revisit our assumptions and approach challenges and opportunities in a new light. So I have an excellent panel with me to discuss these issues, and in the first round I just want a very sort of open-ended but brief perspective on what's going on. What are sort of some of the key developments that you think we need to pay attention to, maybe also where we had gone wrong in the past, and extrapolate from that. So first up is Kristin Shi-Kupfer. She is a director in the research area on politics, society, and media at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Kristin, over to you for just a few observations.
Yes, thank you very much, and everybody. I would say we not necessarily did get it wrong. I very much like the model Professor Dresner introduced to us. If we tend to choose the extrapolation point of view, the last 5 years, yes, of course, maybe we were utterly naive. We projected our own trajectory would like to see China to follow, and clearly Xi Jinping has not been interested from the very start. He took over power, and he made that very clear actually in 2012. But if we follow the other, so to say, path, the model, the equilibrium, and taking our view really a little bit further back, for the last 40 years, and China is going to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the so-called reform and opening policy, we basically had an ongoing struggle. We had waves, like every 10 years, basically, we had a populist bottom-up movement, which would, together with parts of the elite, would challenge also the political system, sometimes starting from economic policy. So we had it in 1979, we had it in 1989. I think this is what most of you are still aware of. We then had it again in 99. The workers' movements, also attempts to register in all big cities what was called the Chinese Democratic Party. And then in 2008-9, just right after the Olympics, we had the Charter 08 by Liu Xiaobo, which he really was successfully aligned a lot of Chinese, not only discipline, but also from within the system, professors, economists, to really bring together with the Communist Party, or with parts of it, a kind of change in the political system. So I would say, looking a little bit further back, we had some reasons to believe that China would take a different trajectory, because there have been Chinese people advocating for it. We had these kinds of movements, which part of the elites also joined, but they have been repressed, and they had been renegotiated in a contract of saying, no, we take good care of you, no worries, we will make the economy grow, and in exchange of that, you keep silent. You respect that one-party rule might be, after all, the best option for China. But we had constant efforts to challenge this.
No, but I think my point was that the West had sort of made the wrong assumptions, and that had not really anticipated this very rapid rise of China. At least the Americans, I would say, have been very caught off guard. I would argue that most of us in Europe as well. And I mean, how did that happen? How could we not have seen this very fast trajectory of economic growth, of also not just growth, but technological advancement on a scale that I don't think we have ever seen. I mean, it was mentioned earlier today that more investment went into AI to China than the United States in the last year. I mean, this is really sort of a wake-up call.
Right, sure. 2 points to that. The first one is, probably because we didn't have a model, because all so-called socialist systems have failed. But I think we tend to see from the very beginning that China was much more pragmatic, right, from the start. It was never also in the economic realm. Of course, we had the state-owned companies. Of course, we had state planning. But from the very beginning, again, looking 40 years back, they have been ready to experiment and to really take bits and pieces from the capitalist, so to say, systems, which they then adapt and integrate, and they had a strong capacity to do that, actually integrate in their own model. And second point, very briefly, I think also because a large part of our economic elites, the companies, they profited from it, and the political elites supported it. So it was not only a matter of we not foresee it, but we were also, large parts were profiting from it, and there was no alternative to think anything against of what the CCP also advocated. Stability first, economic rise, development is good for everybody.
Very interesting. I mean, one of the things I want to get to later on is, I mean, maybe we are seeing the emergence of a genuinely new model of economic development that hasn't existed like this before, because when we traditionally have thought of state-led economic development, it's always been a failure. So I think no one was maybe really anticipating that this could actually work or be even more successful than the traditional Western models of economic development. Now I turn to she warned me. She said my name is unpronounceable. So, Ji Ju?
Yujie, the other way around. So,
yeah, okay.
That's fine.
But she said very kindly, you can call me Cherry, like the fruit, which I'm going to do if you don't mind. So, Cherry, you're a research fellow on China at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. Some of your thoughts on what's going on here?
Well, 2 things in here. Firstly, I think we somehow in the West has undermined or underestimated the capability of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a party governed the world's largest asset. This is the party you have around 88 million population of members. And just to imagine the sheer scale of that political party. And that is the party which governing that large country. Somehow everything is not exactly defined by ideology, but it's a party defined by its governing performance legitimacy, how well the economy has been performed in the past 40 years. So if I want to put a benchmark for Xi Jinping, how well I'm going to judge his performance, it will be ultimately the success or failure of the economy. That's for the President Xi. So given we have that governing capacity constraint on the one hand, then on the other, inevitably, the policy have to really put how to develop domestic economy first. So in here, we're talking, I heard many people talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, talking about AIIB, talking about economic reform or state-owned enterprises reform. Daniel was talking about it. Ultimately, it have to contribute to the how to make sure the income level of every household continue to rise, and in order to make sure people are randomly, reasonably happy about it. So is that the sense of very different social contract? On the one hand, we do offer you economic freedom, whereas on the other, we cuff your hand to stop your political freedom, the freedom of express yourself. So is that contradiction constantly going on? So that sense of paradox happened inside China, and I think somehow in the West we haven't really get it. I mean, just by looking at the European Union, the whole notion for the European Union engaged with China is very much based on normative values. How are we going to make sure we change China to become more like us, to become more like a liberal democracy? And I don't remember for how many times the European Union have tried, but for how many times does that really work properly? And I don't know. I mean, of course, the Chinese Communist Party welcome to have different ideas, but at the end of the day, this is the party with enormous sense of confidence and stridence, and make sure itself try to reassert its rightful place in the history. And that sense of to have the right place in the history is not only shared only by the Chinese elites, but more importantly, that has been shared by the ordinary Chinese people, and especially among the younger population. So often what I really confuse is every time when I go back to China to teach and to study, doing research, the questions a lot of young people pose me is, why the West, why the European Union hate us so much? This is rather revealing. I mean, I'm afraid these are the Chinese young people you have to work with in the next 50 years and try to work out where is the solution.
That's very interesting. I mean, that perception that you describe, that is surprising. But is there a feeling that there is envy of the economic success that China is enjoying, or is it the increased political role? What is your feeling?
I think it's a feeling of that because we experienced the end of history moment after 1989. But however, China has been going into the exception of every element of that end of history moment. So the West itself is questioning why liberal democracy could not work inside China. That's the ultimate question.
But you as well describe essentially, because this is about democracy and governance, it's a new way of governing, I think, that you are describing. You say we sort of grow the economic pie, but I think you said you would cut the hand off.
Yeah, you cuff your hand.
Yeah. So that's very different. I mean, to sort of enjoy economic success. And so is it a new type of, sometimes people talk about digital authoritarianism. What are we seeing here? What would you call this? Because it's not traditional communism. It's not capitalism. What is it?
It's an authoritarian government, put in a very blunt way. It's an authoritarian government, but it's the government and the party which are much willing to learn quickly on the technology, and therefore using the new technology to governing a large population. So that's the new model of governing. But I think at the end of the day, even though we might disagree on democratic model or not illiberal democracy, I think what really counts at the end of the day is the accountability of that government. So judging how successful government it is or not, in any standard, in democracy or in non-democratic government, is how much they're really accountable for its own people. But I think so far, Xi Jinping already realized that difficulty, because given the economy has been slowing down, this ongoing US-China trade war, and how far he can make sure he delivered economic success on the one hand, but then on the other, the ordinary population also have many other wants and needs. The want of having cleaner air, the want of having my children going to the right school I want to. And these are the basic needs so far Xi Jinping has failed to deliver. So this also, again, the basic governance question he has to answer. And he actually looks far less powerful than he looked like from the outside.
That's interesting. I mean, what you seem to suggest is sort of a trade-off, for in exchange for economic growth and for cleaner air and for certain other tangible benefits, that one would forego some of the political freedoms. I'm sure we'll get back to that in a moment. Thank you for that. Our third speaker is Daniel Rosen. He's founding partner of the Rhodium Group, which is an independent research provider combining economic data and policy insight to analyze global trends. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Is this mic's working okay? Yeah, I think it is. So through the economic lens, I have a somewhat different perspective than the one we've kicked off here with. Let me start with this perspective. If in 1978, China had then been as wealthy, as well off per capita as Nicaragua was that year, then its average growth rate from 1978 till today would be 3.9%. That's what China's actual performance was if it hadn't been so super extraordinarily immiserated and impoverished as it was at the end of the 1970s. So the baseline we use to judge a nation's performance creates a narrative in our head that can be sometimes misleading as to how great a bargain it was that the Chinese people traded their political freedom, traded the health of their children and themselves vis-a their environment to get to where they are today. It's really not that stellar a performance as we sometimes think. The two top-level questions for the panel: did we get it wrong? How can we fix it? We didn't get it wrong. We can't fix it. Let me start with that. Why we didn't get it wrong, right? Whether we got it wrong or not, we sort of start this conversation around WTO accession, principally, right, these days. That is President Trump's bête noire for where we made our big mistake and got into trouble. When, at the time China entered the WTO, the extent to which they were converging with the standard run-of-the-mill Western model of how you fix a broken economy was so clear and obvious that nobody could possibly have walked past what Beijing was willing to put on the table in terms of commitments and just let it go. China had gone from having 5% of its prices set by the market in the 1980s to 95% of all prices in China were set by market transactions in a marketplace. Only a very small number of prices were no longer market determined. Tons of other examples we can point to make clear that China didn't have an alternative model. It was simply going about getting to a standard approach to structural adjustment of its economy on its own terms, in its own way, a very authoritarian way, very different, in fact, than other developing countries had taken. And they had an extraordinary ability to control the narrative, to tell a story that GDP growth never varied, not very often anyway, that it was 20, 30 consecutive quarters of the same GDP growth as we report today, which of course is not true, not correct, but people were willing to kind of forego frankness and honesty because it seemed to be supportive of growth to do that. Fast forward to today, the essential problem with our engagement with China today is that the superficial commitment to convergence and the real, actual movement in the Chinese reform agenda in a convergent way with the OECD approach, which, remember, runs the gamut from, Italy to the United States. There are lots of different versions of the OECD approach to a market economy, but any of them would be fine. But Beijing of today is literally saying we're not converging. We have an alternative model, an approach, which is a revisionist statement as to what's happened the past 30 or 40 years, I would say, that all of a sudden makes it very difficult to maintain the permissive, engaging strategy that's been applied in the United States and European, in Europe, European Union, elsewhere, until very recently. What happened? Where did a convergent China shift to being at best, China moving in parallel? And Katarina from Stockholm, they'll remember the joke I told in Stockholm last week that my 11-year-old told me. It's a shame parallel lines never meet. They have so much in common. Right? So it's a shame if we're not going to meet, because really we have so much in common. We both need the same effective policy mix that will produce economic growth at the end of the day. And over the past 6 or 7 years, China's ability to deliver that economic growth has really hit a turning point. So many things that impelled China on that, call it 10%, call it 4% GDP growth pattern over 4 decades, things that were tailwinds for them, like demographic dividend, the fact that almost any road you built was going to open up positive returns on investment somewhere in the Chinese economy, and that you could take things like environmental controls out of the business model, making companies more competitive in a sense in the short term, and defer those higher business operating costs for the long term. Those things, none of them are present any longer. You've reached the sort of end point of a low environmental compliance ability to drive an economy. No more demographic dividend either. So the past 6 years, many of my colleagues and friends in Washington actually would argue that China stopped reforming altogether. I think that's completely wrong. During the Xi years, there have been 4 or 5 first-order attempts to take the next round of economic reform forward. Tried to open up and liberalize the equity markets, failed. Tried to fix the interbank market system that creates the shadow banking, failed, nearly seized up the entire financing system of the country 4 years ago. Tried to reduce the financial account barrier to let cross-border capital flows move freely, saw $1.2 trillion go out the door in almost less than 18 months, failed, had to revert to lifting the capital account back up, and I could go on. But the point is that China is actually trying very hard still to implement what the IMF would call a fairly standard model of economic reform in the system, because what they're currently doing is not actually delivering the goods. China's debt service alone today is 2 times the value of annual GDP growth. Bank assets in China are 50% of global GDP. So the miracle of the past 5 years has been running up an absolutely epic amount of debt that can never be properly worked out and written off. Something's going to have to change, and that something lies before us. What we're doing, what you see being done in the United States, not by me, I am not Donald Trump or his administration at all, and to a considerable extent, Europe following suit in the investment screening area and some other areas as well, is just the first round of our attempt to figure out what a self-protective set of policy corrections would be should China not be able to find its way back to a convergent track toward the way that normal market economies run. Because, I'll stop there.
No, but I have a follow-up question, which is, it's not only about the economy or China's ability or willingness to reform. I think the anxiety comes a little bit more out of a certain assertiveness that we maybe weren't used to. It's around security concerns. It's around seeing that through the Belt and Road, we're bringing a new type of development assistance into other countries. So I'm just saying it's not only about the economy. Maybe very quickly, just 1 or 2 minutes on some of these issues and some of these anxieties that may exist.
Yeah, a lot of the Chinese external power projection issues that concern national security people and on the economic space as well today were quite foreseeable, or not really surprising at all, in fact. It's the Chinese projection of interests and power abroad in combination with the divergence away from a more or less liberal approach to how the system runs. That married with the fact that because China hasn't figured out yet how to make the next round of economic reforms without giving up political control at home, because that's essentially the problem, that you can't have market allocation of resources, as the third plenum documents put it, while at the same time a single party controls who gets capital and who doesn't. We're talking about moving that to the market. Because of that, China is reverting back to a chauvinism and nationalism to keep people kind of rallied around the party and around the flag, and that's actually not very healthy tendency, and it's making security professionals acutely concerned about what will happen if China doesn't find a way to self-discipline that sort of recourse to nationalism. as a replacement strategy for growth that no longer is possible to achieve.
Okay, very good points. We don't have that much time, so immediately, even though I still have many questions, maybe we just do a quick round on the size of China, because I think it seems to me that in the past, maybe such a large country it was a challenge, but is in the digital age. Has that been a game changer? Because we always talk about speed and scale is so important, and this is what China can deliver now. No problem with data privacy. You can just work with all the data, and you can immediately have hundreds of millions of users. Has that been the game changer? Is digital what made this possible?
Well, I mean, you're talking about like economies of scale. Sure, that's also not only in the digital sphere, but also partly when we're talking about business models. That's of course an important aspect. And I mean, China is still like talking about the digital divide. Of course, there's still some regions which have some catch up to do. But yeah, I mean, in general, the market as you could see, a laboratory, a data laboratory is clearly something which is driving China's development in, for example, in AI. But, I mean, on the other hand, talking about big data, and this is also one of the reasons why China is now trying to, and successfully also exporting, for example, their facial recognition technology to Africa, Zimbabwe. There was CloudWalk, a Cantonese, Chinese company.
Are we exporting digital authoritarianism?
Yeah. First of all, let's stay with big data. They're exporting it because they realize only big data is not enough. It's also about the diversity of data. It's about data management. So all I'm saying is, I mean, economy of scale, big is not enough. And also the Chinese government is recognizing it. But yes, of course, it has been, especially in the initial phase, it has been a very important game changer to spread this out. And again, I mean, talking about smart cities, this is, I mean, when you talk to Western companies, they get really bright eyes and saying, wow, everything is possible. This is really a laboratory of the future. And we can discuss whether or not it's a good laboratory or if this is the best way to
Sherry, just very quickly.
Just very quickly, Daniel was talking about China as a revisionist power. I mean, I slightly disagree because China chose to revise on the elements which it can revise and stay within the same intent, the element it can't change. So technology and cybersecurity is obviously one of the elements China will be able to, with its sovereignty, with its powers. I mean, if we're talking about cybersecurity, China has its own version of cyber sovereignty. Everything has to be done within its own territory, confined territory, unlike in here, we understand it's more like a transnational issue. So that just shows you the different ideas. And also on the other hand, Chinese Communist Party is a party that really have a very quick learning curve. As soon as after the 19th Party Congress, the first gathering for the Politburo, so the top 25 most powerful men in China, what they have done? They study AI. And that's just indicate you how quickly they adapt things.
I have to say, I went to China a few weeks ago, and I met with some of the internal think tanks in the ministries. That was unbelievable, I have to say. I mean, that was really a degree of knowledge and agility, where maybe, I mean, we talk about democracy. There's so much noise in democracies. We have to tend to so many different groups, and there was just much less concern about having to do all of these things. And you could just really deliver on the technology and the innovation and all of that. Very quickly from you, Daniel.
So China has the potential to realize an extraordinary upside value from its ability to deploy technology so pervasively through society because of the authoritarianism that is at Beijing's disposal. But at the same time, let's note that cutting off a Chinese telecommunication company from its inputs, high-value inputs from Europe and the United States, will instantly put that company out of business, as we discovered with ZTE over the summer and more recently with Fujian Jianhua Semiconductor. Many of the biggest names in Chinese technology are really untested outside of their home space in terms of their durability in a truly competitive environment in which they don't have a particularly advantageous access to capital. With an infinite amount of capital, any country on the planet could stand up the biggest technology firms in the world. But that condition, that limitless access to capital, has created separate problems in China that are quickly coming to a head today. And then I just finally would note, and we discovered this in America back in the 1990s, technology is mostly valuable, not just for those tech sectors, but how technology can be deployed as a general purpose technology, asset across the whole of an economy, so that there's enough flexibility in the system that you can use the information technology gives you to do non-tech things more efficiently, to make bank loans better, for example. Can Bank of China, with all the technological data they're scraping off transactions, actually change its loan book and stop giving money 85% to SOEs? No, absolutely not. So you invest in the tech, and then what do you do with the data that the tech gives you? There's too many kind of impediments to actually implementing the fruit of all that tech inside China.
Very good. Thank you. I see here that okay, Katharina, we come to you first, and then, okay, go ahead. But the quick question, we do a round of questions, we come back.
Thank you. Many thanks to a great panel. Two quick questions.
Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Katharina Engberg. I'm with the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies in Stockholm. Two quick questions. One, would it be better to understand the relationship between China and the West as a relationship between a state capitalist system and a liberal capitalist system? And what would be the implications for the way now the WTO rules are being renegotiated? Is that a more healthy way of looking at that relationship? Secondly, unless Xi and Trump reach an agreement at the G7 meeting, which is not likely to happen, there is great risks that the relationship between particularly the United States and China will continue to deteriorate. Should we fear, as Europeans, that we at one point will be put to choose between the United States and China in a conflict between the two?
Very good. Thank you. Pass it on to Nick Gowing, and then we come to you, Professor Dresner.
Thank you, Anne. Nick Gowing. I'd like to suggest we rephrase the title of this a bit to Tigers in the China Shop. Can we and will we get it right? I say that for two reasons. Recently, I was in Central Asia chairing something about the Belt and Road Initiative, and inevitably there were two leading academics from Tsinghua and Beijing University saying that there's no design to the Belt and Road Initiative, there's no strategy. It depends on bilateral relations with host nations. And secondly, the issue of what is happening in terms of influence. I have on my iPad here a picture of Waterloo Station last week, which across 15 platforms, there's a sign saying Chinese Global Television Network News, encouraging people going home in the south of England to watch Chinese television news now. And I say that in a country where, after all, the Chinese are going to build our next generation of nuclear reactors. It's about the influence that they have. And building on what Jakob was saying earlier about Russia, it's about how long the Chinese horizon is on this. They're doing this already, trying to convince minds in that little island across the channel called England.
Thank you so much, Professor Dresner. You can pass it forward here.
Thank you. I guess two quick questions. One is on Belt and Road. What? Oh, sorry, Daniel Dresner at Tufts University. The first question is on Belt and Road, which is, to what extent, you've already seen the sort of recent stories about Belt and Road has been the degree of pushback it's received from places that presumably would have been more receptive to it, places like Malaysia and Pakistan. And I guess my question is, how do you see BRI evolving over time? In other words, is this pushback only going to be temporary, or is it going to continue to go forward? And for that matter, will in fact Xi actually have a strategy with respect to BRI? Because I agree with Nick, it's not obvious to me there is a strategy with respect to it. The second question is, one of the things that's changed in China over the last year or so has been the notion that it's gone from having pride in its China model being autonomous and being distinct from the West to now actually having a proselytizing concept to it, to the notion that other countries should also adopt the China model, much as we have done. My question is, how successful do you think that kind of proselytizing will be?
Very good. Thank you so much. I saw the gentleman over there. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Laurent Bonneau. I'm an economic historian. One of the things the Western countries certainly got wrong in the last 15 years was too much debt. In spite of China entering the century with the highest foreign currency reserves in the world, I'm not convinced the country did much better with indebtedness due to its situation today. How do you extrapolate the debt level of China in the soon coming future? Thank you.
Very good. We go, I think that's Julia, and then I will come to...
Yes, I'm Julia Staud from the OECD, and I have a question that builds on what I believe you said about China being a laboratory of the future. And I find that when we talk about China, we often talk about lots of things that we don't want to maybe follow and copy and that we find scary. But I actually think that a laboratory of the future sounds pretty great. So my question to you is, can you maybe share one or two learnings that we could take from this approach here to the European Union or to other governments in this room? Thank you.
Very good. We're going to go to the gentleman here, and then there's a gentleman there. And then we will need to wrap up. Very brief, please.
Gerhard Stahl, Peking University, HSBC Business School, former Secretary General of the Committee of the Regions. I think you already, in your debate, somehow underlined the arguments for the fundamental question I want to raise to you. You said we can't fix it. The problem with China. If one assumes that China will not change its system because it's successful, and I could add some arguments why the successful system will continue even for the next decade, looking also to debts and other issues, we can see that in a country like China with still 600 to 800 million people who enter the modern economy, a high growth rate will be guaranteed, so debts are not the same problem as in other countries. But my question to you is, if we can't change China's model, what do we have to think about changing our own model? Because to compete with China, if China continues with its state-planned market, socialist market economy, and we have to compete, then we have to question ourselves, what does this mean for our system? You already touched on it. How is the way between public authority and the private sector to be developed if we want to compete with this state-run Chinese system?
Very good. Thank you so much. And the gentleman over there, and then we'll have to wrap up.
I'm Joachim Isaacson from the UK MOD. And my question is about the implications of the US trade war with China, where some say it's the best thing Trump done for humanity, perhaps without knowing it himself, because when you look into the debate in China, it seems like there's a recognition of a vulnerability in the Chinese economic system, and there's a debate, if you follow articles and so on from Beijing University, that reform again need to be stressed to promote the domestic market. There's an outreach of a cooperation to Japan, led to Abe, Prime Minister Abe visiting China, and Jinping possibly coming to Japan to shake hands with the emperor, and willingness to find a place in multilateral institutions. So is there a possibility at all that this has an implication on Chinese behavior?
Very good. Thank you so much. I mean, we won't be able. I will let you choose what you want to get into. And I have to ask you. I mean, we're running a little bit out of time. I mean, 1.5 minutes.
Yes.
Apologies. The rest you have to explain during the cocktail reception.
Thinking about 1.5 minutes for all the three of us, or for what each?
No,
then
no.
I should, okay, super.
1 minute each. Okay. So
okay, super.
I'm generous.
What can we learn from China, and should we change our own model? I think the one thing we could learn from the Chinese government, though, is really the understanding of the disruptiveness of technologies, and to really think about technology as an instrument for governance, for really concepts of order, of societal guidance. I mean, this foresight, I think this is really something we could definitely learn. We have taken a much slower and much smaller approach to technology. We shouldn't change our own model to the contrary, and this is tied to my very last remark. Also what Cherry has said, we should not forget China is not the CCP, and the CCP is not Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping is not uncontested. And by improving our models and being also confident what Europe still is, also being confident about how important privacy will be also from an economic point of view, from a professional point of view, that data management, for example. We should really compete also for the ones within the Chinese elites, and especially the young people, who still look very much to the European model, to lifestyles, to education, the way you can freely discuss, voice your opinion. We should really compete for those people by improving our own model and be more self-confident also what we still get right.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much. Cherry.
Right, okay, pick up the question on Trump, Xi, and whether Europeans have to fair to choose a side. And I don't think so. Actually, I think European Union is actually in a more advantageous point, because at the end of the day, in the shorter term, US-China trade war, this is going to impact China far more than the United States. And China is already actually began to looking for the help from the European Union. But however, the answer from this side of the world is saying, actually, Brussels share the same complaints together with the United States. So European, I think, has already chosen the side. But on the other hand, I think ultimately, this is really the good opportunity to ask China to change its economic behavior. Because historically, how China reformed itself, it has never really been done by reform within itself, happened was inside China. It has always been done through external forces since 1840. So that's your chance. On the Belt and Road, I obviously agree with Daniel. Belt and Road Initiative, it is no any grand plan. If you ask me whether it's a clear plan for Belt and Road, there's no such a thing. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very classical Chinese practice that is opaque in implementation plan, fluid in nature, and such practice has been very familiar among the Chinese political elite. But in this part of the world, we're still getting very confused about it. So if I may use an analogy, think about Deng Xiaoping's economic reform back to 1979. It's so-called that across the river without touching the stone. And I think Xi Jinping actually took stock from that ethos, try to practice the Belt and Road Initiative, exactly what he does. So, yeah, over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much. Daniel.
So many good questions. I wish I had much more time to offer some thoughts. But let me just really hone in on one thing. When I say we can't fix it, that doesn't mean it can't be fixed. That means we can't fix it. This is China's problem. China's going to have to fix it in its own way, right? It's China's concern to find its way back to an economic policy mix that actually produces good returns on the assets and the toil and hard work of the people. We need to be very, very careful what we take away from the situation about our own system. Some people are very tempted for us to follow some Chinese practices. For example, industrial policy is very attractive in many circles, and to some extent, it's going to be unavoidable that we think about industrial policy solutions to some of our technology issues right now, I think, right? But by and large, what we need to do is understand what is and isn't working in China so we don't mischaracterize China's performance right now as admirable in a way that would lead us to try to follow suit. That goes for other countries, also on the question of whether China's alternative is persuasive or not. It's going to take a lot of transparency right now to make sure that people don't make the wrong policy conclusions from what's taking place. The biggest external client for China's assistance in the world today is Venezuela. And that's not an example anybody really wants to follow, right? So one needs to be extremely careful in the developing world about what you learn from China's many, many successes. China needs to make sure it doesn't get tangled up in its own rhetoric and misunderstand where its own policy reform interests lie. And we in the more advanced economies need to be most careful of all that we continue to defend principles of rationality and science and transparency in order to find our way forward to the least disruptive adjustments we need to make.
Thank you so much. I think that's the perfect way to wrap this up. It's obvious we didn't even scratch the surface. There's so much. I mean, we could have done the whole day on this. But you were extremely generous with your insights. I want to thank you. Also very open. So I really, really appreciate it. Let's give a warm round of applause.